Hello, everybody out there. This is Brad Dyke, just reaching out to you to say hi. And today's video is to talk about the differences that I've experienced as a 32-year veteran in IT between the Microsoft operating system and both Unix and Linux OSs and their distributions. The takeaway that I always have with Linux and with Microsoft is there's always good and there's always bad. It really dictates what you want to do based on what you would like to have your functionality for. Many of us look at Linux as a service. We want to build a web platform or we want to build a specific service we want. Well, a good old reliable command kernel and your service, and you got yourself a very stripped down Linux instance that can do what you want it to do. Many people look at Linux that way. Microsoft, on the other hand, is more of a distributed multi-service function. People think of it from a desktop perspective as well as potentially the, shall we say, the server perspectives, but in a graphical user interface. Now, the value of command line interface versus GUI interface is that you need both. CLI works on the principle of specifics. GUI works on the principles of many. But you work with both of them to accomplish what you want, and we do that usually by using a GUI interface tool with a CLI scripting subtool. And when people think of Microsoft, they don't really think of command line or the DOS prompt, as many of us oldies would say. We would think of it more of like, okay, I'm going to install an application, I'm going to get it run, I'm going to secure it, and I can use it, and voila, I've got myself a server service. Not the greatest service in the world compared to maybe a Linux version, because it's cleaner, leaner, and more secure, but it meets all your needs and it's easy to work with. Don't discount that last statement. It's easy to work with. So, my issues with both Microsoft and with Linux. First, starting with Microsoft. Microsoft always tries to dictate to you what they think is best for you. They really do. They really think, okay, I know what's better for you. You don't know what you think. And even though many of us work in their industry and support their environments, they kind of close their minds off. Sometimes they open up and listen and create a great tool. A lot of times they don't. So that's the first problem. The second thing is, it really isn't Microsoft's responsibility to help drive the hardware industry by restricting resources so that you're forced to go and buy the latest and greatest because the vendors want more reciprocation for using their operating system. The third issue with Microsoft is that you really don't truly dictate the nature of a standard, you recommend it. And they try to dictate it opposed to doing a recommendation. That's also on the API side, that's application protocol interface side of things, which is a common thing you see today. You didn't see that 10 years ago, but you see it today. They really want to establish a standard that's their standard. We saw this back in the day of Novell, when Novell was dictating and dictating and dictating how they thought your tools need to function and work like. Now, the other side of that is the flexibility, and that is the pros of Microsoft Office and Microsoft OS and Microsoft tools. They really do have a overall general consensus by experience only, by the way, of a fairly solid set of tools that are very reliable, plus by them establishing their baseline standards, which is what they need to have to make things work, not necessarily what they want to dictate to you. They've built a truly standardized environment. Thirdly, they kind of lean to Apple a little bit about the appliance mindset. That means you buy something to do 2 or 3 things and that's it, and then you throw it away and go buy a new one. But they also understand the value of not doing that, and that's very, very, very important. And the last part of it is they have an expandable base of user environments, and that means we really have a great sampling of users out there that Microsoft has. Now, so what I've done here is I've talked about the pros and the cons of Microsoft. So let's talk about Linux. Linux is a different kind of beast. There are 2 ways to view Linux. One is to realize that you're looking at a very simplistic standard, and that's the whole secret behind Linux. It's simple, it's clean, it's efficient, but it doesn't offer much, and you have to go out there and build what you want. in many regards. Now, that's not always the case out there. They've gotten better over time. So we're going to go over the values of Linux. We'll talk a little bit about Unix, and then we'll basically say what is good for what. First, let's talk about Linux. Linux is a derivative of something which was known as Unix. Actually goes way back into the days of SCO Unix and many older variations of disk operating systems. Linux is a cleaner version, more of an individual user-based version of Unix. So we're going to skip Unix except for the historical value and go straight to Linux. And that's going to be talking about the nature of Linux. Now, Linux initially started as what we call a command line interface operating system that worked very much like DOS. And you could load up what we call graphical user interfaces once you booted up the device into the CLI mode. Over time, distributions began to come out that had promoted something known as X Windows. And you started kind of seeing a little bit of a Microsoft Windows kind of mindset, GUI interface, but also a lot more. Now, using Linux as a personal desktop is a challenge. I don't care what distribution you have. I don't care what anyone says. Even on Linux Tips, I got bad news for you guys. Prepare to do a little research. Prepare to understand that when somebody posts a video about how to do 1, 2, 3, 4, well, that was 6 revs of your software in the past 2 years ago, and there are new commands and so on that have kind of messed up that process. It's not so simple as it sounds. That's the disadvantage of seeing videos about Linux is if you don't pay attention to the date, you might be wasting your time because there are a lot of changes that do happen over a span of a year. So when you work with Linux and you start to do things like, for instance, I want to be able to play a game, or you want to be able to, use a user interface, or you want to set up a specialized tool that's in Microsoft, but you need compatibility to make that happen. The secret weapon there is, okay, do your research, actually take the time and do the step-by-step 1, 2, 3s, and you will probably most likely be successful. But it's not like Microsoft where you could go out and download an exe file and install it and voila, you're operational. The next thing about Linux is it is not a standardization footprint. In other words, you have a lot of different variations out there that exist, and you have what's called compatibility requirements. Compatibility requirements is almost exactly the same problem as you have with installing applications that you might have enjoyed on, let's say, Microsoft Windows. You have to take the time and just do a little reading on, for instance, GeForce drivers. Great example. They're not the most compatible and most functional. Sometimes you have to do a couple of extra steps to get what you want, what you had in your Microsoft Windows environment. With that being said, the detail about Linux is, again, you really have to stop, do your research, find the right files, the right revs, the right releases, and then properly install them in the right order so that they'll work. I know that sounds a little bit of a pain, but working with both Microsoft and Linux and Unix myself, I've learned that the truth of the matter is these operating systems each have a strength and each have a weakness. So you use that to your advantage by playing to the strengths. So that leads us to the last two details, and that is Linux has the ability of being able to offer many services, a staggering number of services, but you have to configure the service. That means, yep, you got to open up terminal, and yep, you got to configure file, and yep, you got to put your values in there. Sorry, it's not a GUI interface most of the time. And the last thing, which I think is important, and remember, I'm only saying these things because I want you to be realistic. I do think it's valuable for you to have a desktop, even a virtual desktop, of Linux to use it because it's a great fallback, as I did. I fell back to it from Windows 11. I just didn't like how Microsoft was invading my space and my privacy and so on. And I said, okay, that's it. I'm stripping you out. And I took it out and I went to Linux. And it's been a little bit of a battle, but not bad. I particularly am using Mint Cinnamon. It's 20.14. I'm sorry, 20.4. And it's pretty functional. It's a very diversified version distribution. I'm a full spectrum architect in the IT industry, so I need everything, unfortunately. So, and I do enjoy a couple of good games, and I want some compatibility and so on and so on. So I use Mint, but your distribution really truly is this last detail, what I'm going to talk about for Linux, and that is know your distribution. If you know your distribution, you'll understand the nature of yourself. So take a piece of paper out, write down what do you want? What do you want in an operating system for your personal desktop? What do you want in an operating system that is your professional desktop? And do you need secondary services? May they be TrueNAS or TierDash or something like that that you really want to have out there? Write it down on a piece of paper. Then go out and begin to research the top 10 distributions. With that, you'll have the ability of doing quite a bit. Knowing the distribution and how those particular distributions work for you is really valuable. I mean, if you like Debian Linux or if you like Ubuntu distributions and so on, there is also Linux distributions such as Pop, which is more geared to more like an Apple type setup. It has a lot of functionality in regards to being able to be desktop-ish kind of footprint. There are so many different variations out there that you can fit to what you've written down, to what you think you are as a desktop user. Now, the truth of the matter, at the end of the day, once you've looked at what you've got and you want to look at, okay, I want both. That's the truth. I want Microsoft for its strengths and I want Linux for its strengths. Don't want the weaknesses. I can use each other to balance each other out. Now, most of the time, that only pertains to the nature of services. A web service, an application service, a tier service, SMTP for mail services, and so on and so on. Binds versus DNS or DDNS, and so on and so on. So when you start the process of saying, what do I want to do? Take a little bit of time. Find out what Microsoft is strong in services for desktop and for services for server, Microsoft Server 2019. And then look at Linux and look at the Linux server services and find out, man, I could really build a really secure environment, have some fun with it and enjoy it, and learn how to cross-platform OSs like I do. Because the key detail at the end of the day is, does the product meet your needs? That's the truth. So my personal review on Linux is they got a ways to go, but much better than it was 15 years ago. And I can tell you by personal experience that they're starting to come into their age. And when Linux does come into the age of its future, it will genuinely change dramatically. And we will have what we would call an API-based world where everybody can actually interact with software programming fairly easy. I mean, really easy, like the difference between writing a Microsoft Word document or not. It can be that easy. And a lot of things in our households, in our lives, our vehicles, and so on, could integrate safely with each other and in a secure manner. Now, the last thing that you need to understand is Microsoft wants to go free. And what I mean by free as in they don't want to really cost you much money. But to do that, they need your information. Weigh that against what you do on the desktop. Obviously, don't do anything illegal. Don't do anything that is suspect. Just enjoy your desktop environment. And if you feel that, I don't do anything on my computer except read email and maybe buy a few things, then please use Microsoft all you want. But if you're in an IT environment and you're in a secure process and so on, with the vulnerabilities of Microsoft lately, I kind of recommend that you gravitate to Linux because there's one last super valuable thing about Linux that Microsoft does not have. And that is each individual desktop build out is unique. That's the key. Yeah, they install standardized. But once they go into their hardware environments, they become unique operating systems. Islands in the ocean, basically. Opposed to one standard that even using what we call a security ID, or known as a SID, common deployments, which means an island nation. In other words, a bunch of computers that have the same deployment models are all hackable by the same attack. Linux systems are not. They're a lot more difficult to attack than you think. Requires a lot more skill set. So think about that too. Well, this is Brad Dyke signing off, and I hope you guys enjoy yourselves. Have fun, learn. Don't forget, you can always blow it away and start over. And you guys take care. God bless.